over and settle down into a conversation up here. Listen, I think the fact that this room is full, that it was sold out really early on, is a testament to how important immigration issues are to the people of the United States of America. It has been an important public policy issue throughout our history, but has been elevated over the last couple of decades, and you can see that in a lot of the political debates that have been occasioned by the immigration issue, by how states and local governments have struggled with it in the political sphere during campaigns, how candidates have tried to have a policy forum around immigration on various occasions, but have a stand and really try and set out a set of viewpoints about it. Last year, the United States Senate, and Larry noted this, the United States Senate passed an immigration reform bill. It came on the heels of several states having acted in a variety of ways over the past several years, including Colorado. Many of those actions wound up going to the court system, and some being upheld, and some being struck down. And so the United States Senate took it upon themselves in a bipartisan fashion to pass a comprehensive immigration bill. The United States House of Representatives at the same time passed 5 separate measures out of committees. They were waiting to be heard and still are waiting to be heard. We had, if you looked at the program early on when we announced it, Congressman David Dreyer from California, who we expected to be here and who we hoped would offer a viewpoint really from Republicans in Congress, because it's an important viewpoint in this country. There's been recent activity at the House of Representatives level from the Republican caucus and from Speaker Boehner. The Speaker announced a set of principles that they wanted to negotiate around. Very much those principles were represented by the 5 different bills that have passed out of the House. And then shortly after that, made an announcement as well that they wouldn't take up immigration reform in the House of Representatives until they got to a better place of being able to trust President Obama and believe that the things that were in the Senate bill and in many of the House bills, as they negotiated, believed that the president would do the things that they thought were important to do first and really sort of put on hold the immigration debate in the United States House, and making it difficult, if not impossible, then to negotiate with the senators until they actually have passed either a bill or a variety of bills. Well, we lost Congressman Dreyer because of a canceled flight from LA, and so we don't want that voice to go missing, and I've asked all of the panelists in one way or another to think about what's happening in the House, what's happening in the Republican caucus, and even if you may disagree or may be critical, to talk a little bit about the differences that exist. One of the most significant differences that exist is that there is not in any of the 5 bills a pathway to citizenship for people who are presently in the country in an illegal or an unauthorized fashion. But the Senate bill does have a pathway to citizenship, and so it starts off with a major difference from what's already in the House. And as we said, the Speaker has said just recently, I think it was February the 6th, that there was not going to be negotiations around that bill or a vote on the House floor of any of the immigration bills until they had a greater trust that the President was going to move the agenda on immigration in the way that they saw fit. So with that, I'm going to start with Senator Bennet and just ask you, Michael, if you would kick this off, and we're going to ask everybody to keep their answers kind of short, but kick this off with a discussion about 2 things. One, what you think are the fundamentals in Senate Bill 744, but also, how did you get there? How did you get a bipartisan group of senators to a place where you got a majority vote on this and passed through the United States Senate?
So thank you, Bill, and Larry, thank you very much, and Carol, and everybody for being here tonight, and the other panelists, and for the Attorney General for filling in for David Dreyer. We appreciate that very much.
I appreciate the 2 hours notice.
What's going to be, so let me first observe what you observed, which is the number of people here tonight show you how many people care about this issue from whatever perspective, and it's entirely consistent with my experience traveling the state of Colorado for the last 5 years. I knew about this issue from the standpoint of the kids in the Denver public schools, and I understood The fact that the broken immigration system that we had was having a profound effect on them and on our community as a result. But then when I started to hear from the peach growers in Palisade, I'd hear that they're having a really hard time holding on to their peach orchards, because their family businesses, because of this broken issue. The cattle ranchers on the Eastern Plains, something else. The ski resorts, something else. The high-tech companies in our state. There is not a part of our economy that isn't affected by the broken immigration system that we have, and that's why I was interested in going to work on it. We developed a set of principles that we called the Colorado Compact here in Colorado. I put them in my pocket. I went to the most functional city in the world, Washington, D.C., looking for people that would cooperate or collaborate on getting this done. And I might start there with how did we get it done? Because it might be interesting for people to know here, for example, that the pathway to citizenship was not controversial at all in the Gang of Eight. The 4 Republicans and the 4 Democrats that were part of that from the very outset believed that that was a fundamental part of what we were trying to do, because all of us agreed that we didn't want to have a permanent subclass of people living in the United States of America. We can talk more about that later, and there are other viewpoints on that, but just to give you a sense, the visas for guest workers were much more controversial in the Gang of Eight than was the pathway to citizenship. The way we got there was by having 8 people of goodwill that were actually trying to legislate on behalf of their constituents and on behalf of the country. And everywhere I go in Colorado and everywhere I go across the country, even if I'm in a room full of Democrats only, when people are bemoaning how terrible it is back there and talking about how much we've earned our 9% approval rating, I always say that I hear you, you're right, but listen, the model of legislative leadership that I've seen, or the greatest expression of leadership I've seen in the 4 years that I've been there, was the leadership supplied by John McCain, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, and Jeff Flake, the 4 Republicans who sat at that table for 7 months, knowing what some people in their party were going to say about them, but willing to do it because it's the right thing in their view for the country and for their party secondarily. So having the right partners at the table. This was absolutely the highlight of my time in the Congress, and if we had that level of leadership on all kinds of other issues, we would be just fine as a country. Finally, just the bill itself, if you take time to take a look at it, it starts off with border security. We could talk about what the elements are in there, but they're very, very strong elements on border security. Then there's an earned pathway to citizenship that actually doesn't create what some people call a special pathway to citizenship, but puts people at the end of the line. It's very rigorous. I'm happy to describe the details of that. We also, over time, shift our immigration system from what is sort of known as a family-based system and more toward what we call a merit-based system based on the needs of the U.S. economy going forward, so we don't find ourselves in the position we're in today. And another critical component, and I'll stop here because I'm wearing everybody out, was internal security. That is an e-verify system, so our small business owners, and business owners of any size for that matter, no longer have to be the INS or play a role of trying to decide, who's here legally and who's not here legally. But we create a situation where it's really hard to get a job here if you're not documented. Which is going to, I think, do more to reduce the flow of immigrants, illegal immigrants to the United States, than anything else we do in the bill. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks.
So thanks. So the House Republicans, prior to Speaker Boehner talking about not wanting to negotiate, they put forth sort of a set of values that they want to operate around on their negotiations. And the first was border security and interior enforcement has to come first before you pass comprehensive legislation, including a pathway to citizenship. You have to implement an entry-exit visa tracking system. You need employment verification and workplace enforcement, all before a comprehensive system. You need to reform the legal immigration system internally. We need to really take care of youth that are here and that are either here legally, but the children of illegal immigrants, and we need to view those people that entered illegally as people who are sort of living outside the rule of law and need to be brought in. And this is written down, and this is what they talked about. So, Linda, I know you've been critical of some of the things that have happened recently with the House, but I'd like you to, if you can, just sort of offer a point of view about immigration, and you've written on this extensively, but offer your point of view about why these issues exist, why this isn't a kumbaya moment in Washington, D.C. between the House and the Senate.
Well, you know, it is a little bit frustrating because I, like most Americans, feel very, very strongly that we have to have a secure border. And my concern is more focused on the people who might be coming in to do us harm, the kind of thing that Larry Meisel and the folks at the cell are focused on. I'm worried about drugs that come across the border, and I'm worried about criminal activity that comes across the border. So I believe very strongly in border security. But the fact is, we now spend more on border security than we do on all other law enforcement activities that the federal government does combined. All of them, FBI, Customs, you name it. All of the money put together does not equal what we spend now on border security. Secondly, we actually have a more secure border today than we have certainly any time in my 66-year lifetime. Border crossings are down. Historically, they are at, you know, a 40-year low. I am not a fan of Barack Obama, as anybody who's heard me on Fox News or reads my columns can tell you, but Barack Obama, when it comes to border enforcement, he has deported more people who are here illegally than any president in U.S. history. So I am concerned about border security, but what is frustrating to me is that the single best and most effective way to secure our borders is not to build higher fences, it's not to put more technology out there, it's to create a legal way for people to come. If you want to stop illegal immigration, then what we have to do is pass legal immigration reform that allows the United States to welcome to this country people who are going to take jobs that otherwise would go wanting. And so I think what frustrates me a little with the Republicans is I think they've got their focus on the wrong thing. Let's not even be talking so much about what happens to the 11 million people who are here illegally. That we will have to solve. But the first thing that needs to be solved is we need a way to bring willing workers to the United States. It's good for our economy, it's good for the country, and if we don't do that, we'll never solve the illegal immigration problem.
So let's go north. You know, if you're a consul general, your title is general. If you're an attorney general, your title is general. So we actually have two generals. So I'm going to go by first names if that's okay.
It's like Stratego.
So I'm going to go by first names. And Marcy, a couple questions for you. When I was governor, we actually had members of my cabinet go to Alberta and look at how the provinces handle immigration. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about just how Canada handles immigration issues differently than the United States. And then I'd like you to really give sort of the viewpoint that Ottawa has about immigration reform in the United States. So please start.
Good. Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity, Larry and Melanie, to be on the panel this evening. And I'm glad to talk about the northern border. And the northern border has some distinct characteristics from the southern border. And I'm glad to share some of Canada's immigration policies and practices, and perhaps this is an opportunity to share best practices and learn from another, but I can only tell you what's working for our country. So a few examples. First of all, our immigration system almost always has been built around economic immigration. So nearly 65% of immigrants to Canada come for economic purposes, and almost 50% of our new immigrants actually come with post-secondary degrees. And we've set this as a policy objective in order to attract the best and the brightest, and in order to remain competitive in the global competition for talent. And in fact, last week there were some changes that were made to our immigration system, and the minister decided to raise that economic threshold to 70%, the balance going to family reunification and refugee. So when you compare that to the United States, about 75% of U.S. immigration is linked to family reunification, and less than 15% is related to economic. So a big difference there in the type of people that we're trying to encourage to come to Canada. Second part of our strategy, which is relatively new, is that we really see international students as an engine for growth. I mean, we are a small country. We are a population of California spread across a landmass greater than the United States. So we need to look outside our borders for population growth. And if we want to compete in the world arena, which reminds me, does anyone have any hockey scores for tonight? Sorry, I digress. It's all about Olympics, not hockey. If we are to compete in the world arena, that we realize that education plays a key role. So the government of Canada actually recently announced that it's going to double its international student body by attracting 445,000 new international students by 2022. And in addition to recruiting more students, and on this topic of pathway to citizenship, in order to prevent brain drain, we are ready, and we will improve our system to allow all international students to be eligible for a 3-year visa immediately upon graduation. That's already in place, and then a pathway to citizenship.
Which is dramatically different than what we do in the United States.
Right,
where
and we
are
also give very
experienced.
generous work permits
Yeah.
for students and their spouses and their families who come to join them in Canada. And finally, a point that Governor, you raised with me when we spoke on the phone. So like in the US, immigration in Canada is a federal responsibility. However, one fact that is unique is that we do delegate some responsibilities to the provinces to manage their local workforce issues, because some of them are very, very different. So British Columbia, for example, needs to recruit creative artists to meet the needs of the digital media industry. So they have a local program where they can attract a certain threshold of those type of artists. Alberta, they are always needing skilled workers in the oil sands, so they manage that separately. Not separately, it's within the system. So our immigration works for us, our system works for us. It has huge public support, double-digit public support, the greatest in probably anywhere around the world. We also, just on the topic of temporary workers, we have a very robust temporary worker program. Someone told me earlier today that they knew somebody, was it you?
Me.
Who got kicked out of Canada after they extended their temporary worker time. But we need those people to fill immediate and urgent needs. We have a very strong agricultural worker program with Mexico where we bring in agricultural workers, and people tend to come and go when they're supposed to.
And it's managed by the provinces.
And that's managed by the province. And
Yeah.
the deportations and the exits are managed by the province. And, you know, maybe people don't like working in Alberta in the winter. That's why they leave, but they do all leave.
Can you just talk a little bit about Ottawa and how
Yes.
they view immigration reform?
Yes. So, well, obviously anything that happens in the United States affects Canada. We're #1 trading partner. We share the world's longest land border, water borders, et cetera. So anything that changes in the U.S. impacts Canada. In the bill that is currently presented in the Senate, there are a few implications for Canada. One of them I wanted to mention was there's no border crossing fees in that bill, which is excellent, because anything that impedes trade between Canada and the U.S. is not good for competitiveness for either country. And that's a $1.7 billion a day border, so that's
How
really
many people?
important.
How many people come in the United States on a daily basis to work?
300,000 people cross the Canada-U.S. border every single day. So anything that impedes the legitimate movement of people and goods is very detrimental to our relationship. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the border security infrastructure and all the cross-border joint law enforcement initiatives are also something that resonate very well with us. I don't know if you're familiar with the Beyond the Border Action Plan. This is a Canada-U.S. action plan that it's been in place for about 10 years on different names, but it was relaunched by President Obama and Prime Minister Harper in 2011. And we have 4 pillars to this initiative, and it's all about sharing information, cybersecurity, threats, et cetera. And the other thing I wanted to mention was in that bill that I'll be really pissed off if they lose is they increase the number of days that Canadians over 55, and that doesn't apply to me, so snowbirds, it increases the time that they can actually stay in the U.S. without a visa. So I wanted to mention that because my dad's watching tonight from Miami Beach, and he wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, General. So just a point of personal privilege, John Suthers is a good friend of mine. We served as DAs together, and I think that John is the only person in the history of Colorado who served as a district attorney. He served in the 4th Judicial District, which is El Paso and Teller counties. But then he also served as the United States Attorney and as the Attorney General. So really in local, state, and federal offices that are about law enforcement, and nobody else in our history has ever had all the privilege, really, of serving in those three places. John, I know you've only had a couple hours, but this isn't the first time you've thought about this or talked about it, and certainly not the first time we have. Would you sort of share from a law enforcement perspective how you view the immigration system and, the need to fix it, and even the parts that you might or might not like about the conversation in Washington, D.C. regarding the fix.
You bet, Bill. I see several law enforcement people here, and I don't pretend to speak for them all. But I have had a great deal of law enforcement experience on the local, state, and federal level. And I've come to the conclusion that from a law enforcement perspective, our current immigration system really is broken. I think where it really struck me is when I was the United States Attorney. One of the priorities of the United States Attorney's offices throughout the country are prosecute something called aggravated reentry. These are individuals that have been in the country illegally, have committed a serious crime, have either served time, been placed on probation, or have fled, gone back to their country, have then re-entered the United States. And merely by re-entering the United States after having been convicted of a serious crime here, you are committing another serious felony. I think it's a minimum 5 years. Right. And that's a priority prosecution for the U.S. attorneys. So here we had a situation in Colorado. I noticed virtually everybody that was arrested for aggravated reentry, the only time we figured out that they were in the country is when they committed another crime. There may have been isolated situations where someone was just picked up on a speeding ticket or something, but almost uniformly, they had committed another relatively serious crime. Well, here's why that was the reality. At that time, and I was the U.S. Attorney from 2001 to 2005, we estimated we had about 200,000 to 225,000 undocumented aliens come into Colorado primarily for seasonal work every year. It's probably a smaller number now. Folks, 90% of these people were no kind of public safety threat whatsoever. They were working in the seasonal job, sending money back to typically Mexico, were oftentimes leaving after the seasonal employment. But they were undocumented. And the fact of the matter is, law enforcement had very little capability of figuring out, from a law enforcement perspective, who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And the problem was this dysfunctional worker permit, worker visa system. We have so few legitimate permits available that have no relationship to actual economic supply and demand, that we had literally 200,000 people coming in doing this work that were undocumented. If we had sufficient documented or a process of documentation so that we knew who these people were, it'd be a heck of a lot easier to filter out the people that aren't supposed to be here. And so it's really a highly dysfunctional system, related primarily to that. Then you've got all the exploitation that takes place of immigrants because they have to operate in the shadows. My office has prosecuted on a couple of occasions people that set themselves up as what are called notarios. And they lead the immigrants to believe that they are immigration lawyers or whatever they're not. And they take fees up front from them in exchange for helping them with their immigration status. In fact, they're just rip-off artists. And we've prosecuted 2 such organizations that had collected over $2.5 million apiece from immigrants. In my opinion, as I've closely examined the problem of human trafficking for both labor exploitation and sexual exploitation, I think our current system exacerbates our ability to deal with human trafficking, once again, largely because the victims, and a lot of the victims are undocumented immigrants, have no incentive to come forward, and we basically have to stumble across this from a law enforcement perspective before we're able to do anything about it. So, I'm a conservative Republican, and I could argue to you why having people who are in the country, having come here illegally, should not be rewarded with citizenship, and we can accomplish the same thing by giving them a legal status and let their children and grandchildren become citizens. But from a law enforcement perspective, there's no question, and I think most of the cops here would agree with me, this system is very broken.
So, John, one of the things that you and I have talked about before is how also in law enforcement, people who are here in an unauthorized fashion or illegal fashion don't report crimes. Even when they're the victims of crimes, they don't report them, and how that's disturbing to a district attorney or a chief of police.
Very much so. Whether it's they're victims of human trafficking, whether they're victims of these fraudulent immigration services, whether they're simply victims of other kinds of consumer fraud. And I'll tell you quite frankly, it is oftentimes the case that immigrants are exploiting immigrants. But because of the fear that reporting this sort of conduct will result in their deportation, there's unbelievable underreporting of this kind of conduct to the detriment of law enforcement.
So again, we lost Congressman Dreyer, and I think he would have had a different viewpoint than any of the panelists. I'm just going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. One of the things that they say, Senator, is just do border security and they call it interior enforcement. So enforcement inside the country, workplace, e-verify, use, electronic verification. Just do that first. Right. Don't do the comprehensive stuff that the Senate's tried to do. Get this other stuff out of the way, and once you do that, then we're willing to talk about whether it should be a guest worker visa program or a pathway to citizenship. What's your response to that?
Well, so one thing I want to do is be precise about this, about who the they is. Because I think there are House Republicans that actually want to pass immigration reform, want to include a pathway to citizenship. The set of principles that you read off are entirely consistent with the Senate bill, my view. And for whatever it's worth, I think John Boehner would really like to get this done. But I do think and Paul Ryan would like to get this done. They have a group of others that are having a harder time with it. Here's my answer to them. First of all, remember that we had not just Republicans on our Gang of Eight, but two from a border state, John McCain and Jeff Flake. And I can assure you that the number one issue for them and their constituents is border security. For them, it's a daily issue. I mean, John McCain can give you a very moving speech about what's happening to people that come across the border illegally that are found dead in the desert in Arizona, and I've heard him give that speech. He took us down for a tour, by the way, of the border. We flew down there in helicopters to look at it. And if anybody wants to know why you can't build a fence across the entire thing, I'm glad to share my pictures from that trip. But those two guys had to assure themselves that we were good on border security in the bill. And we included in the Gang of Eight bill $8 billion of border security. And a requirement that before anybody could get a green card in the United States who's here undocumented, anybody could get a green card, some of the following things had to happen. 700 more miles of fence had to be built as part of this. Actually, I'm skipping ahead. Sorry, let me just back up. So that was ours, $8 billion. By the time we got it off the floor of the Senate, the budget for border security in the bill was $46 billion. That was the price of admission to get some more people on this. It's the reason why we got almost 70 votes in the Senate. And a requirement before anybody gets a green card that we build 700 more miles of fence, that we hire 20,000 more border security people, that the E-Verify system is up and working so that our internal security is taken care of. This first principle from the House comes out of our bill. I mean, that's what we say in the bill. Now, I happen to think I would love it if what the House were focused on was, hey, maybe we don't need to spend all that money on border security, because maybe having a border agent every 1,000 feet might be more than we need, but what we really need are ports of entry between the United States and Mexico that actually work really well. What we really need are customs agents on the border to move folks back and forth in commerce so that we don't lose the $6 billion a year that's estimated that we're losing because of the way the border is set up. But the politics of the moment are that we're not going to get the opportunity to do that, I don't think, right now. So I would say that I have no pride of authorship over these parts of what we did. And if there are better suggestions for making it more efficient, and frankly, doing it in a more fiscally responsible way, I would be all for that. And I'll stop here. The challenge is that Americans and Coloradans see all these things as normative goods. They see securing the border as a good. They see the pathway to citizenship as a good. I'm not making this up. I mean, the polling in Colorado among Republicans shows a majority of Republicans support a pathway to citizenship, and that's true across the country. In Washington, in the blood sport of the politics of Washington, D.C., which is the opposite of the way the Gang of Eight approached these issues, what people say is, well, I'm not going to give you citizenship until you assure me that every single, inch of the border is secure. I'm not going to give you high-tech visas until you give me these ag visas. As we're hearing up here, look, we're competing against Canada. They're going to have 450,000 students that they're going to get into their higher education system, and they're going to keep in Canada. And in the meantime, we're educating people here, and then we're saying to them, even though we subsidize their education, please go back to India and China as fast as you can to compete against the United States of America. That's the message we're sending today. If we pass this bill, we lift those caps. In fact, those students are no longer subject to the caps. And if you graduate with a STEM degree, broadly understood, from an American college and you've got a job offer, we'll staple a green card to your diploma. And if we're not going to be willing to do that, then what we're saying is, Canada, please outcompete us. China, India, please outcompete us. Mexico, outcompete us.
I'm going to come to you, Linda, but I just want to ask you if you recognize that every time you answer a question up here, the whole stage moves. I'm wondering if that happens in the United States Senate. So Linda, the president talked about this in his State of the Union, said, get it done. And Michael touched on this, but I'd like you to talk about the political appetite, not among politicians, but among the public. What do Democrats think about this? What about Republicans? And really, the Latino population as a population, not that they all think alike, but how important is that to this issue as a political issue for Republicans?
Well, I'm happy to talk about that. And in fact, the public opinion poll, and it doesn't matter who's doing the poll, from Fox News to the Washington Post to the Pew Hispanic Center, no matter what poll numbers you look at, a large majority of Americans want immigration reform. They want to see our laws fixed. Everybody recognizes the system is broken. The most recent polls show that about 2/3 of Americans want to see a change in immigration, in our immigration laws, and want to give legal status to people who are already here legally. The question on citizenship is a contention among some conservatives who don't want to see what they would say people rewarded for having broken the law. The Hispanic population really doesn't differ very much in terms of their overall views on immigration and immigration policy and how to fix it from the American population in general. Again, if you look at the polls, they're roughly the same. And by the way, immigration does not rank as one of the top 3 or even the top 5 in most polls, issues of importance to Hispanics when it comes to voting. But that's a little deceptive, because in fact, it may not be one of the top voting issues. They may think national security and education and economic, good economy is more important than immigration. But it does touch an emotional chord in the Hispanic community, and it's important to understand why. There are 52 million Hispanics in the United States. 1 out of every 4 of those Hispanics knows someone who has been deported. So that's a huge number of people. Almost 20 million of those Hispanics live in what are called mixed status household. In other words, some members in the households are legal. They may have been born here, they're US citizens, or they came here legally, but someone else is not. So for that population, this is a very scary emotional issue. And when you have one party, and I regret to say that it is a party that I'm a proud member of, the Republican Party, talking in terms, as Governor Romney did last time around, about things like self-deportation, it scares people. You're talking about somebody's grandmother, somebody's cousin, somebody's brother, somebody's child. And therefore, you're going to have a very, very emotional response. But I would like to go back just a minute to what we said about border security, because I think this is a very important point. I worked for Ronald Reagan. He is my hero. He is the man who made me a Republican. I had been a Democrat until Ronald Reagan was elected. Ronald Reagan has got to be turning over in his grave now, hearing some of the talk on immigration. Not least because, Ronald Reagan was for small government. He did not believe that the way you solved a problem was to throw money at it. And yet, when you hear some conservatives today talk about the border control issue, it's all about let's pour more money on it. Let's make sure we've got more of a federal bureaucracy. Let's hire more people to work for the federal government. Let's turn every employer in America, including anybody out there who wants to get their lawn mowed or their child taken care of, into an adjunct of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and make them check legal documents. This is not a conservative position. And secondly, I'd like to say that on the issue of the fence and the idea of 700 more miles of fence, fences do two things. They do keep people out. They also keep people in. You talk, John, about the kind of migration that used to take place when we had many people coming here illegally, working seasonally, and then going back home to Mexico or wherever. That was because they had some assurance that they'd be able to get back across next year when those jobs came available again, and it was time to pick crops. They can't do that anymore, in part because, so they're stuck here. And they're stuck here in an economy that isn't providing jobs. And so we've actually created, I think, more of a problem by keeping people stuck on this side of the border who in past times would have crossed back over. And again, there's only one way to fix it, and it isn't through building more fences, putting more barbed wire. You can't even do what the one candidate in my party said last time, which was to station people with guns to shoot people trying to come across the border. That's not going to solve it. The only thing that's going to solve it is to move to a system like the one Marcy talked about that is economically based, market-based, flexible, and that gives people a legal way to come here.
So, the moderator clap. In the last census in Colorado, it's an election year, but in 2010, the Hispanic population was over 20% for the first time, and the performance of the polls was a little over 14% for the first time. So it's a really important vote, and like we said, they don't all vote. Hispanics don't all vote and monolithically, but it is this important block. John, if you were talking to a candidate in Colorado running for a statewide office or for congressional office,
There's some of them in the audience.
well, if you were talking to them, and you can say your piece now, how would you talk to them about trying to work this out in Washington, D.C., because it really has to be done in D.C.?
Yeah, by the way, we've had a little bit of discussion, federal versus state issue. Folks, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution enumerates all the powers that the federal government has. And I, for one, have sued the federal government multiple times saying you didn't have that power. But trust me, that's the one power they do have. Immigration and naturalization is given to the federal government. And that was the essence of some of the decisions that have come out in the last couple of years. States can do things that are complementary, but they can't do things that are contradictory to what the federal government is doing. My advice to Republicans is to talk about this in a rational sort of way. There's a real temptation. This is a party that's got Tom Tancredo back in it, running for governor, and yet it's got some very thoughtful people on immigration in the Gang of Eight and stuff like that. So I like to think of it as a big tent. It's just kind of a crazy tent, that's all. But if you're going to not just, I give this speech every day. You cannot, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you cannot get elected in this state unless you get a majority of the unaffiliated votes. And you got to talk to people in a way that's not going to come with these 30-second sound bites that's going to take care of your caucus constituency. You know, my big gripe about how we were organized in Colorado is our caucus system drives politics to the extreme, because you're not going to win an election unless you get the nomination. If you go to a convention, I think even the Democrats will admit, although I think Republicans have been victimized by the system more than Democrats, you guys seem to coalesce better after the fact.
I managed to lose mine.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is our caucus system and convention system drives people to the extremes. Let me give you an example, a perfect example of this. In the last election, 2% of the people in Colorado supported Ron Paul. Guess what percentage of the delegates to the Republican State Convention supported Ron Paul? 40%. That's a system that gives undue influence to radical voices. But I just tell Republicans, folks, focus on winning a general election. Yeah, you got to get enough votes to get through the primary process, but you're not going to win a general election in this state with the type of rhetoric that's going to turn off a lot of unaffiliated voters, including Hispanic voters. 20% of the vote. You're going to have to get a decent percentage of the Hispanic voters in Colorado to get elected to statewide office.
So Marcy, we're going to shift gears a little bit because we're at a CEL event that really is about educating people about terrorism and how to prevent terrorism. And so from the perspective of national security, how important is immigration policy in Canada, and how important do you see it to the United States?
Sorry, I didn't hear the
National
question.
security?
National security.
Yeah, protecting your borders, not just from,
Right.
People coming across who might, go to your schools or use your healthcare system, but really who intend to do harm to your populace.
Well, I just want to make a couple of comments just on the securing the border, and I don't know if that's going to be helpful, but it's probably not going to be helpful, but I just thought I'd mention it anyhow. So U.S.-Mexico border, 1,900 miles long. They want to build a fence, 700 miles plus whatever, I don't know. Canada-U.S. border, 5,524 miles, 117 land border crossings. We are never building a fence. Don't ask us, it's not going to happen. But there's other things that you can do to secure the border. It doesn't have to be a fence, and it doesn't have to be hardwired. And some of these things are about addressing threats early, so making sure that people are traveling on trusted traveler programs, making sure that your law enforcement are talking to one another just the way that Canada has with the United States, making sure that DHS knows who's coming, who's going, electronic travel authority, and also the other thing that's really interesting, and this is something that we're doing at the Detroit-Windsor crossing, is these public-private partnerships. So maybe there does have to be some expense made at the border, and it is going to be construction. So we've struck a deal with the United States where we're going to build the bridge, because the trade between Canada and U.S. at the Detroit-Windsor crossing is so important to us that we're going to build the bridge, $2.1 billion. You just need to come up with like $250,000 for the Michigan Customs Plaza, and maybe some other company will help us to privately run it and get the money back, and that's the way that we're going to have that crossing. So there's different models, I guess, for securing the border, and there's different models for constructing things at the border. So I just wanted to mention that. The other thing in terms of the threats to the border, well, first of all, terrorism, obviously a big threat. Terrorism is a domestic issue, as we learned at the CEL today. We did the tour, and we know these things are homegrown. These things happen in countries around the world. And so, these are things that we are really concerned about. And we're also concerned about these sort of individuals, these lone wolves who become really self-radicalized or very hard to detect. And these are the kind of things that we're looking at the border. The other thing is transnational crime, so illicit criminal activity, guns, drugs, people smuggling. This is the stuff we're doing. And in that regard, we've created this national counterterrorism strategy in Canada, and this is part of our Beyond the Border sharing with the United States. And in that regard, also with securing the perimeter, another asset that we have here in Colorado that we all share is NORAD. So NORTHCOM, we have 140 Canadian troops at NORAD, and that's how our airspace gets protected. So those are the kind of things that we're concerned about at the border, just as the United States is concerned about. It's not the same kind of issues at the southern border.
John, you want to hop in?
Yeah, I think that's important. There are some commonalities between the northern border issues and the southern border issues, but there's some dramatic differences.
Right.
The cartels, their supply chain comes Central America, Mexico, and into our country. And Michael, I don't know what billions it takes. 46 sounds a little outrageous to me. But we do need to stay absolutely on top of the technology it takes
Right.
to make the border as secure as possible, not only for humans crossing the border, but this incredible flow of drugs that come into this country. And you might say, well, you can't stop it. You can do a lot better job than we're doing. I just want to emphasize to you that the cartels are incredibly flexible and malleable in terms of how they respond to changes in law enforcement in the United States. And we got to stay on top of that. Let me just give you an example right here in Denver. We've got a meth problem in Colorado, and we've got a very serious growing heroin problem. If you haven't noticed, it's nationwide. Lots of people dying of heroin overdoses. It appears to be related to our prescription drug abuse problems. As people's supply of prescription opioids is interrupted or becomes too expensive, people are turning to street heroin. And it's just a huge boon to the Mexican cartels. But to show you how flexible they are, they used to bring meth into the Denver metro area in crystallized form, already crystallized. As we got more sophisticated in detecting that at the border, they changed to liquid meth. And believe it or not, we have determined that they have a factory in Mexico that bottles sports drinks. And apparently they've got a connection with a cartel because they're now bottling methamphetamine that's colored to look like sports drinks, bringing it in the United States in great quantities. And we had a very large bust in the Denver area. Folks, that's not going to stop. I'd like to think that our appetite for drugs in the United States would wane. I don't think it's going to, and I think we still do have to do what we can to keep drugs from coming in through Mexico and Central America, and that's going to take ever-constant changing technology and sophistication that is going to cost some money. There's no question.
You've been in the law enforcement business a long time. Do you think that that's possible? That certainly is the aspiration. You can see it in both the Senate and the House versions, that there would be the kind of border security that could stop or stimulate the flow.
I'm not naive, Bill. We're not going to cut it off, but there's a lot we can do to stem it. We can get very sophisticated about money laundering. If you cut off the money supplies, it's a whole different ballgame for them. We can do a better job than we're doing.
So, Linda, there are some folks in your party that they link national security with immigration policy and particularly immigration reform and say we may not be able to have both. That if we really reform immigration in a way where there's a freer flow across the border, we know less about it, and as a result, we diminish our own national security. And I'd really like you to think about that and respond to that, and even criticize the viewpoint or...
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I'm certainly not in favor of just an open border and anybody comes and goes whenever they want to. I think it has to be orderly. I think we're a sovereign nation. We have the right to say who comes and who doesn't come. I just think that we also ought to be doing ourselves a favor economically and make sure that we can bring in the workers that we need. But part of what John said earlier, I mean, I absolutely agree with. One of the reasons you want to have a more generous legal immigration program is so that you do the checks, so that you know who's coming. And I have absolutely no problem with parts of the bill that suggest that we have to make sure that when you get a visa and it's stamped that you get to stay here for a certain period of time, that we know whether or not you leave at the end of that time. That's what I think of as interior enforcement. I grew up at a time when every January there used to be ads on television. If you were a resident alien living in the United States, you had to go to the post office and register and let them know where you were. Well, we gave up on that. We no longer follow where people are once we let them in. I think we ought to spend more time focusing on making sure that the people we let in, first of all, have had the background checks. Secondly, have the skills that we need. We need people at the high end of the skills level, those STEM workers that Senator Bennett talked about, but we also need the people to work in the poultry processing plants and in our agricultural fields and to do jobs in the service industries. But we have to make sure that once you get that legal right to enter, and it might be a guest worker, it might be in the agricultural field, if you ask the people who are coming here and who are here now whether or not they want to become citizens, first of all, they actually have less appetite for citizenship for themselves than Republicans do for them. About half of Republicans think that they ought to be given citizenship, but it's only in the 40s, 44 or something percent of illegal immigrants who think that's really important. So you know, I do want to make sure that we do know who's here, why they're here, and by the way, if they commit a serious crime, they're out. And they ought to be sent home, and we ought to be making sure that they come back. But when you ask, you know, can we ever stop that flow of drugs into the United States? Can we ever stop the cartels? It strikes me, here we have 22,000 or so people at the border, most of them on our southern borders, focusing on stopping busboys and gardeners and babysitters from sneaking across. It's a little bit like we are making the FBI out there making sure that people are not jaywalking. We ought not to be having those law enforcement officers focused on people whose crime is that they want to work to provide for their family. They ought to be focusing on those meth dealers and heroin traffickers and human traffickers and drug cartels that want to operate here in the United States. And if we had a legal way for people to come so they didn't have to spend all their time trying to intercept the guy just coming across to try to work so he can feed his kids at home in Mexico, we'd have more of those resources devoted to keeping out serious crime.
So, Senator, I'm going to take a little bit, come from a different viewpoint. There were people who were actually critical, really some from the left, that the pathway to citizenship for the most people it would be applicable to. There are 3 different pathways of citizenship. The one that would be generally most applicable is 13 years. 10 years in one status, 3 years in a second status. And there are people who are critics of that.
Yeah. So if I could just say one word on border security or on national security. It's hard to argue that the system we have right now is great from a national security point of view, you know, which is another reason we should get something done. 40% of the people, this was shocking to me, I didn't know this before I got into this stuff, 40% of the people in this country that are undocumented are people that came here legally and overstayed their visa, and we have no system, as Linda was saying, we have no system to tell us, hey, so-and-so was supposed to check out of here today, but they didn't check out. Or where are they?
Which is what they have in Canada.
Which is what, you know, most industrialized countries have, and which is also encapsulated in the bill. And a final point on border security, and then I'll come to the pathway. The reason we felt that we could do it for $8 billion, not $46 billion, is because the extraordinary advances in technology that we have acquired as the result of our experience in Afghanistan, you know, where we can see, once it's deployed, every square inch of the border in a way that we have never been able to see it before, which means we're going to be able to see a lot more of the folks that are coming across, not at border crossings, but who are smuggling, you know, drugs one way and guns the other way, and that seems like something we ought to do. There are a lot of people that have been critical about the length of time in the pathway. I might say that it's 13 years for most of the 11 million. There are 2 exceptions for that. The Dreamer, the kids that were here through no fault of their own, who we put on a 5-year pathway, again, not controversial in the Gang of 8, and ag workers, because a deep concern that they wouldn't have an incentive to stay in agriculture if we had the longer pathway, so we made that 5 years too. First immigration bill in our history where the ag jobs part of it has been endorsed by both the Farmers Union and the growers all across the United States. That's never happened before. I understand the criticism, and it is a tough pathway. So for people who say it's a special pathway, it's special in the sense that no one else has ever had to confront a pathway like this. You have to confess that you committed a crime, you have to pay a fine, you have to go through a background check. If you don't pass the background check, you go home. 6 years later, you have to go through another background check. And finally, when you get to your 10th year, you can get a green card if you can show that you are earning a living in the United States or you're not a public charge in the United States, which means we don't have to support you. And you can show that you're learning English, and you can show that over this period of time you haven't been convicted of a crime. Then, and only then, and after we do all the border security stuff I talked about earlier, can you get a green card and then 3 years from that be able to get your citizenship. As a political matter, there's been some concern about, maybe these people are going to become voters for one party or the other party, and that's a reason to slow this down. My worry is, I think the real question the real debate we're having is not about a special pathway or not. The question we're really having is, are we going to make it a bar for all time that somebody came here in an undocumented way? And people can have a principled argument about that. I think that's a lousy idea from the standpoint of the United States, because most of the people that came here that were undocumented, we wanted them here to drive our economy. That's why they were here. And second, I don't want us to turn out to be, look like one of these European countries where you've got a group of people in the geography that do not have a commitment to the future of the democracy or the future of the economy because they're kept out perpetually. Maybe 13 years isn't the right. Maybe we've got harder and tougher things we can do for people. Maybe there are other things, but the idea that we would say no to this very American idea, I think we will regret. But I will tell you this, we may not get it done right now. I think we will get it done before the next presidential election. We may not get it done right now, but I think it is inevitable that it's going to happen because the demographics in this country are going to make it absolutely impossible for people that are elected to Congress in Washington from most places to oppose this pathway. My view is we might as well do it now.
Could I just say one thing on
Absolutely.
that? Because this is something I've been writing about for 30 years, which is Hispanics and the Republican Party. We have this vision that Hispanics are all Democrats, they're all liberals, that's the way they vote. As I've reminded people over and over again through my columns, in the last 11 presidential elections, 8 out of those 11 elections, 1/3 or more of Hispanics have voted for the Republican candidate. That included Richard M. Nixon. It included Ronald Reagan. In fact, Ronald Reagan had tied George W. Bush for the highest percentage of Hispanic vote, which was about 44%. This idea that somehow Hispanics are in bed with one party or another is just simply wrong. Hispanics, like most Americans, diverge in their political point of view. And if you want to look to the group who Hispanics most resemble in a lot of ways, demographically, it's Italian Americans, who now are a majority Republican. If the Republican Party were doing what Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush did, and Richard M. Nixon did, which was to reach out and talk to them and try to attract them, I think the Republican Party would be getting a much larger share of the Hispanic vote. And that vote is going to be increasingly important. 1/4 of all children in America today are Hispanic. I mean, that is a demographic time bomb if the Republican Party becomes identified as the anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic party. Then it's going to go the way of the Whigs. We are not going to have a Republican Party capable of winning national elections unless we can reach out and attract. And by the way, when they do public opinion polling on how you view yourself, liberal or conservative, Mexican immigrants are actually more likely than Americans in general to define themselves as conservative. 35% compared to about 32% of non-Hispanic whites who describe themselves as conservative. So there is no political reason for the Republican Party to be as worried as they are about these new citizens they are in increasing numbers likely to vote Republican.
And I think you've said in your columns, they agree often on social issues.
Absolutely.
They certainly care a great deal about education. They care a great deal about health care reform, but don't necessarily identify with the Democrats on those kinds of reforms. And they might either way.
And they're very
but they don't.
suspicious of government because many
Yeah.
of them come from countries where government are not the good guys.
Right.
So, that is one of the reasons why, the Republican Party could be a very attractive alternative, in addition to many of these people being very entrepreneurial. The act of leaving a country where your family, is, where you're comfortable, where you know the language, and to take off on an adventure to come to some place where you don't know anybody and you don't know what's going to happen, that requires a kind of entrepreneurial spirit that makes the people who come here very special. We get the best of the best, and that is because of the nature of immigration itself, that it takes that kind of entrepreneurial act in order to strike out to a new world.
So I've got a little earpiece, and the little earpiece just told me that we've come to the end of our time. I think as a co-host of this, Senator, I'd like to give you the last word before I have the last word.
Well, I would
Very
say
democratic.
thank you to all of you, and thank you to the panel for being here. And this is among a number of issues that I think we would be just fine solving if we could figure out a way to align Washington's politics to Colorado's politics. I really mean it. I mean, there's not a place in this state that I worry about going, talking about the importance of this legislation. And I guess what I would close by saying is that in addition to all the other good things about it, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that it's 3 points of GDP, additional GDP growth in the first 10 years, 5 points of additional GDP growth in the second 10 years, and it'll help define our economy in the 21st century at a time when we need to compete like crazy to create good jobs with good wages here in the United States. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Senator.
Larry.
So I think it is just a terribly difficult issue, and particularly in Washington, D.C., it's going to be a difficult issue to move on it this year, but maybe before the next presidential election. But I do think that the people of Colorado have a lot to say about this, care a great deal about it, and the most important thing is probably to communicate with those people who you elect to federal office your sentiments about this, so that and even in this election cycle, people understand that this is an issue that needs resolving. We've really benefited from some subject matter expertise